In the shadows of Buckingham Palace, where whispers carry more weight than proclamations and hidden letters hold the power to topple crowns, security guard Thomas Mitchell has spent 15 years protecting the royal family's most intimate moments. He's seen tears behind closed doors, witnessed heated arguments in supposedly empty corridors, and kept silent about secrets that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. But when Thomas discovers a hidden cache of letters written by the late Princess Isabella, letters that reveal a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the royal household, he faces an impossible choice. The woman he once swore to protect from the shadows had documented everything: the lies, the cover-ups, the deliberate destruction of evidence that could have saved her life. Now, 5 years after Princess Isabella's tragic death in a car accident that many still question, Thomas holds proof that her fears were justified. The letters reveal not just personal betrayals, but a calculated campaign to silence her growing influence and progressive ideas that threatened certain members of the establishment. As Thomas grapples with the weight of this discovery, he realizes that Princess Isabella's stepmother, Queen Consort Camilla, may have been more involved in the princess's isolation than anyone ever imagined. The letters detail meetings, phone calls, and decisions that painted a picture of systematic manipulation designed to discredit Isabella's charitable work and public statements. But revealing the truth means destroying the institution Thomas has dedicated his life to protecting. It means exposing the current Queen Consort as someone who participated in a cruel campaign against a beloved princess, and it means accepting that his own silence over the years may have contributed to a cover-up that cost Princess Isabella her happiness, her reputation, and ultimately, her life. The question that haunts Thomas as he holds these letters in his trembling hands is not whether he can prove their authenticity. The royal seal, the personal details, and the handwriting analysis he secretly commissioned all confirm what he feared. The question is whether he has the courage to honor Princess Isabella's memory by bringing her truth to light, knowing it will forever change how the world sees the royal family. Some secrets are buried for a reason. But some secrets, once discovered, demand to be told. The clock is ticking. The Queen Consort's upcoming state visit will cement her position as one of the most influential royals in modern history. If Thomas is going to act, it has to be now. But first, he must survive long enough to tell the story that Princess Isabella died trying to share with the world. 3. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Windsor Castle, with the persistence of a secret demanding to be heard. Thomas Mitchell adjusted his security badge and checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, 23:45. In 15 minutes his shift would end, and he could finally go home to his small flat in Windsor Town, away from the weight of royal secrets that seemed to press down on him more heavily with each passing year. He had been walking these corridors for 15 years, watching over the royal family like a silent guardian angel. Thomas knew every creaking floorboard, every hidden passage, every room where private conversations took place when the family thought no one was listening. His job was to protect them, but over the years he had begun to wonder who was protecting them from themselves. The castle felt different tonight. There was a tension in the air that Thomas couldn't quite place, a feeling that something was about to shift. He had learned to trust his instincts during his time in the military before joining the Royal Protection Unit. Those instincts had kept him alive in Afghanistan and had made him invaluable to the royal household. Tonight they were telling him to pay attention. As he made his final rounds through the East Wing, Thomas noticed that the door to the private study was slightly ajar. This was unusual because the Queen Consort Camilla always kept that room locked when she wasn't using it. The study had been Princess Isabella's favorite room before her death 5 years ago. Isabella used to spend hours there, writing letters to charitable organizations and working on her speeches about mental health awareness and social justice. Thomas paused outside the door, listening carefully. He could hear someone moving around inside. The soft sound of papers being shuffled and drawers being opened and closed. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, but something made him hesitate. Instead, he positioned himself where he could see through the crack in the door without being observed. Queen Consort Camilla was inside the study, dressed in a dark robe, methodically going through the contents of an old wooden chest that Thomas had never seen before. Her usually composed demeanor was replaced by something that looked almost frantic. She was pulling out letters, reading them quickly, and then either putting them in a small pile or tossing them into a metal wastebasket that Thomas realized with a start contained burning papers. The smell of smoke finally reached his nostrils, and Thomas felt his heart begin to race. Whatever Camilla was destroying, she was doing it in secret, in the middle of the night, in a room that still held the memory of Princess Isabella like a shrine. This wasn't normal royal business. This was something else entirely. Thomas watched as Camilla held up a letter with a distinctive letterhead. Even from his position by the door, he could make out the royal seal and what looked like Isabella's elegant handwriting. Camilla read the letter twice, her face growing pale in the flickering light from the burning papers. Then, with what looked like a moment of hesitation, she folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a robe pocket. Instead of throwing it into the fire, that single action told Thomas everything he needed to know. If Camilla was destroying Isabella's letters but keeping some of them, it meant those letters contained information that was both dangerous and valuable. Information that someone might need later. Information that could be used as leverage or protection. Thomas had known Princess Isabella personally. She had been kind to the staff, always remembering their names and asking about their families. She had treated him like a human being, rather than just another piece of security equipment. During her final years, Isabella had seemed increasingly worried about something, often looking over her shoulder and asking Thomas if he had noticed anyone following her or watching her too closely. He had assured her that she was safe, that the security protocols were thorough, and that no one could harm her within the castle walls. Now, watching Camilla destroy what appeared to be Isabella's private correspondence, Thomas began to wonder if he had been protecting the princess from the wrong threats. The queen consort continued her methodical destruction of the letters for another 20 minutes. Thomas remained frozen in his position, barely breathing, documenting everything he saw. When Camilla finally seemed satisfied that she had destroyed what she needed to destroy, she gathered the remaining letters from her saved pile and locked them in a small metal box that she then placed in the wall safe behind Isabella's portrait. Thomas memorized the combination as Camilla entered it. Years of security training had taught him to observe and remember details that might be important later. He had no idea that this skill would soon become the most important thing he had ever learned. After Camilla left the study, locking the door behind her, Thomas remained in his position for another 10 minutes. His mind was racing with questions and implications. Why was the queen consort destroying Princess Isabella's letters 5 years after her death? What did those letters contain that was still dangerous enough to warrant destruction? And why had she saved some letters while burning others? Thomas thought about Princess Isabella's final months. She had been working on a major speech about transparency in public institutions and the importance of speaking truth to power. The speech was scheduled to be delivered at a charity gala just 2 weeks after her fatal car accident. After her death, the palace had announced that the speech dealt with mental health awareness, but Thomas now wondered if that had been the whole truth. He remembered Isabella asking him strange questions during those final weeks. She had wanted to know about the security protocols for the castle's communication systems. She had asked whether it was possible for someone to monitor her phone calls or read her emails without her knowledge. At the time, Thomas had assumed she was worried about media intrusion or paparazzi, but now he wondered if her concerns had been closer to home. The rain continued to beat against the windows as Thomas finally completed his rounds. His replacement, Gary Henderson, arrived precisely at midnight, cheerful and ready for the night shift. Thomas exchanged the usual pleasantries, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed time to think about what he had witnessed and what it might mean. As he drove home through the quiet streets of Windsor, Thomas couldn't shake the image of Camilla's face as she read those letters. There had been fear there, and guilt, and something that looked very much like panic. These were not the expressions of someone dealing with routine royal correspondence. These were the expressions of someone who had discovered that their secrets were not as buried as they had hoped. Thomas lived alone in a modest flat above a bookshop on Castle Hill. He had never married, dedicating his life instead to his service to the crown. As he climbed the stairs to his home, he wondered if that dedication had been misplaced. Had he been protecting people who were themselves a threat to the memory of someone he had genuinely cared about? He made himself a cup of tea and sat in his small living room, trying to process what he had seen. The logical thing to do would be to report the incident to his superiors. But Thomas had learned over his years of service that the palace had its own way of handling sensitive information. Reports could disappear. Investigations could be redirected. And sometimes, people who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned to less prestigious positions. The safe combination danced in his mind. He had memorized it perfectly, muscle memory from years of observing and recording details. The question was whether he had the courage to use that information. Princess Isabella had trusted him to keep her safe, and he had failed. Maybe this was his chance to finally protect her, even if it was too late to save her life. Thomas finished his tea and went to bed, but sleep did not come easily. His dreams were filled with images of burning letters and Isabella's concerned face during those final weeks. He dreamed of secrets hidden behind royal portraits and combinations that unlocked more than just metal boxes. When he woke the next morning, Thomas Mitchell was a different man. He had made a decision during the restless hours between sleep and waking. He was going to find out what Princess Isabella had written in those letters. He was going to discover why Queen Consort Camilla had felt the need to destroy them 5 years after Isabella's death. And if those letters contained evidence of wrongdoing, Thomas was going to make sure the world knew the truth about what had really happened to Princess Isabella in her final months. The woman who had treated him with kindness and respect deserved nothing less than complete honesty about her life and death. The first step would be getting back into that study and opening that safe. Thomas had access to most areas of the castle during his regular shifts, but accessing the safe would require careful planning and perfect timing. He would need to find a way to be in that room alone, with enough time to photograph the contents of the metal box without being discovered. As Thomas prepared for another day of protecting royal secrets, he realized that he was about to become the most dangerous person in the castle, because he was no longer just a guardian of their privacy. He was now a guardian of the truth. The opportunity came 3 days later, during the annual staff meeting that required all security personnel except emergency coverage to attend. Thomas had volunteered to remain on duty, claiming he wanted to cover for a colleague whose mother was in the hospital. His supervisor had agreed without suspicion, knowing Thomas to be dedicated and reliable. The castle was unusually quiet, with most of the family away on official engagements. Queen Consort Camilla was in Scotland for a charity event, and the other senior royals were attending various functions throughout London. Thomas had carefully checked the schedules and confirmed that he would have at least 2 hours of minimal supervision. He made his way to Isabella's former study with his heart pounding so hard he was certain it could be heard echoing through the corridors. The lock on the door was standard palace security, and Thomas's master key granted him access to all common areas. As he stepped into the room, the familiar scent of Isabella's favorite lavender potpourri still lingered faintly in the air. The study looked exactly as it had 3 nights ago, except for the absence of the wooden chest and the metal wastebasket. Camilla had been thorough in cleaning up the evidence of her late-night activities, but she couldn't remove the safe behind Isabella's portrait, and she couldn't change the combination that Thomas had memorized. He approached the portrait with reverence. Isabella smiled down at him from the ornate frame, captured in a moment of genuine happiness that had become increasingly rare in her final years. Thomas whispered a quiet apology to her memory as he carefully moved the painting aside to reveal the wall safe. His hands were steady as he entered the combination. The safe opened with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the quiet room. Inside, Thomas found the metal box exactly where Camilla had placed it, along with some jewelry and official documents that he didn't touch. The box was locked, but it was a simple lock that Thomas's security training allowed him to open without damage. Inside the metal box were 12 letters, each written in Isabella's distinctive handwriting on personal stationery. The dates ranged from 6 months before her death to just 3 days before the car accident that claimed her life. Thomas photographed each letter carefully with a small digital camera he had brought for this purpose, making sure to capture every word clearly. As he read through the letters while photographing them, Thomas felt his blood grow cold. These weren't just personal correspondence. They were detailed documentation of a systematic campaign to isolate and discredit Princess Isabella, written by someone who clearly understood that her life might be in danger. The first letter was addressed to her former private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, who had been abruptly dismissed from her position 8 months before Isabella's death. In it, Isabella described a meeting where she had overheard Camilla and several senior palace officials discussing ways to manage the Isabella problem before her upcoming speech about institutional transparency. According to Isabella's account, she had learned that her phone calls were being monitored and her emails were being copied to senior staff before she received them. Her charitable activities were being quietly undermined through the withdrawal of royal patronage from organizations she supported. Even her public appearances were being scheduled to conflict with major news events, ensuring minimal media coverage. The second letter revealed something even more disturbing. Isabella had discovered that medical information from her therapy sessions for depression was being shared with palace officials without her consent. This information was then being used to question her mental state and suggest that her increasingly vocal criticism of palace protocols was the result of emotional instability rather than legitimate concerns. In the third letter, Isabella described a conversation with Camilla that had taken place just 1 month before her death. According to Isabella's account, Camilla had suggested that it might be better for everyone if Isabella took extended break from royal duties and public life. When Isabella had refused, saying that her work was too important to abandon, Camilla had warned her that continuing on her current path would have serious consequences for her reputation and her relationship with the royal family. The letters painted a picture of psychological warfare conducted with the precision of a military campaign. Isabella documented meetings she wasn't supposed to attend, phone calls she accidentally overheard, and documents she found in places where they shouldn't have been. She had been building a case, gathering evidence, preparing to defend herself against accusations that she knew were coming, but the most chilling letters were the final 3, written in the days immediately before her death. In these, Isabella expressed genuine fear for her safety. She had discovered that her regular driver had been replaced without explanation. Her usual security detail had been changed multiple times in recent weeks. Most disturbing of all, she had found evidence that her car had been accessed by unauthorized personnel on 3 separate occasions. The final letter, dated just 3 days before her death, was addressed to a journalist named Sarah Collins, who specialized in investigative reporting about government transparency. Isabella had clearly intended to provide these letters to Collins as evidence of the campaign against her. The letter included detailed instructions for verifying the authenticity of the documents and a list of palace employees who could corroborate specific incidents.
But Sarah Collins had never received this letter or any of the others.
They had been intercepted somehow, hidden away until Camilla's discovery of them 3 nights ago. Now Thomas understood why the Queen Consort had been so frantic to destroy them. These letters were evidence of conspiracy, manipulation, and possibly even criminal negligence in the events leading up to Isabella's death. Thomas completed his photography and carefully returned the letters to the metal box, which he locked and placed back in the safe. He returned the painting to its original position and made sure the study showed no signs of his presence. But as he prepared to leave, he heard footsteps in the corridor approaching the study. His heart stopped as he realized that someone was coming directly toward the room. Thomas quickly moved to the window and pretended to check the security latches, a routine task that would explain his presence if questioned. The footsteps paused outside the door, and Thomas could hear the soft sound of keys jingling. The door opened to reveal Lord Pemberton, one of the senior palace advisors who had been mentioned several times in Isabella's letters. He was a thin, severe man in his 60s who had served the royal family for over 30 years. Pemberton looked surprised to see Thomas in the room. "Mitchell, what are you doing in here?" Pemberton's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Routine security check, sir," Thomas replied calmly. "I noticed the window latch seemed loose during my external patrol, so I came in to verify it from the inside." Pemberton studied Thomas carefully, his grey eyes searching for any sign of deception. "This room has been sealed since the Queen Consort's visit the other night. No one should have been in here without authorization." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. If Pemberton knew about Camilla's visit, it meant that her activities had been coordinated with senior palace officials. This wasn't the action of someone acting alone out of panic or guilt. This was part of a larger plan. "I have access to all common areas during my shift, sir," Thomas said, maintaining his professional demeanor. "The window security is my responsibility." "Indeed," Pemberton said, but his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. He moved to Isabella's desk and opened several drawers, checking their contents with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly what should be there. "And did you find anything unusual during your security check?" "No, sir. Everything appears to be in order." Pemberton nodded slowly, but his eyes never left Thomas's face. "Good. I trust you understand the sensitive nature of this room and its contents. Princess Isabella's memory deserves respect and privacy." "Of course, sir. Then you also understand that anything you might have seen or heard during your time in this room should remain confidential. The royal family has enough to deal with without unnecessary speculation about past tragedies." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas recognized it immediately from his military experience. This was how dangerous people warned you to keep your mouth shut without actually making explicit threats. "I understand completely, sir," Thomas replied. Pemberton smiled, but it was the cold smile of a predator who believed he had successfully intimidated his prey. "Excellent. I'm sure we won't have any problems then." After Pemberton left, Thomas remained in the study for several more minutes, his mind racing. The senior advisor's knowledge of Camilla's visit and his immediate attempt to silence Thomas confirmed what the letters had suggested. This wasn't just about one person trying to cover up past mistakes. This was about protecting an ongoing conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the royal household. Thomas realized that he was now in genuine danger. Pemberton would certainly report this encounter to others, and questions would be asked about Thomas's presence in the study. His actions would be scrutinized more carefully, and any attempt to investigate further would be noticed immediately. But the letters had given him something more valuable than just information. They had given him names, dates, and specific details that could be verified independently. Sarah Collins, the journalist Isabella had intended to contact, was still active and still investigating stories about government transparency. Margaret Thornfield, Isabella's former private secretary, was still alive and might be willing to talk about what she had witnessed. Most importantly, the letters contained specific details about Isabella's final days that had never been made public. Details about the car maintenance, the security changes, and the unauthorized access to her vehicle. If these details could be verified, they would provide compelling evidence that Isabella's death might not have been the tragic accident that everyone believed it to be. As Thomas finally left the study and returned to his regular duties, he carried with him the weight of terrible knowledge. Princess Isabella had been afraid for her life in her final days, and her fears had been justified. Someone had been planning her removal from royal life, and when she refused to go quietly, they had found another solution. The question now was, what Thomas could do with this information without ending up like Isabella herself. The people involved in this conspiracy had demonstrated their willingness to destroy lives to protect their secrets. They had systematically dismantled a princess's reputation, isolated her from support systems, and possibly orchestrated her death. But Thomas had one advantage that Isabella hadn't possessed. No one expected a security guard to be a threat. He was invisible to these powerful people, just another piece of security equipment that they walked past without consideration. That invisibility might be the only thing that kept him alive long enough to ensure that Isabella's truth finally came to light. The photographs in his camera contained evidence that could topple governments and destroy reputations. But first, Thomas had to figure out how to use that evidence without becoming another casualty in a war that had already claimed one princess and countless others who had tried to speak truth to power. Thomas spent the following week living with the weight of his discovery, carefully maintaining his normal routine while planning his next move. Every interaction with senior palace staff felt loaded with potential danger. Every routine security briefing seemed to contain hidden threats. He had become acutely aware of how many people around him might be involved in the conspiracy that had claimed Princess Isabella's life. The break he needed came through Margaret Thornfield, Isabella's former private secretary. Thomas had managed to locate her through a careful search of employment records, discovering that she now worked as an administrative assistant at a small charity in London that focused on helping military veterans. It was the kind of organization that Isabella would have supported, and Thomas suspected that Thornfield's employment there was not coincidental. Thomas used his day off to travel to London, telling his colleagues he was visiting an old army friend. He found Thornfield working late in the charity's modest offices near King's Cross Station. She was a woman in her 50s, with greying hair and tired eyes that seemed to hold years of accumulated worry. When Thomas introduced himself and mentioned his position at Windsor Castle, Thornfield's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and she looked around the office nervously before quickly ushering him into a private conference room. "You shouldn't have come here," she said without preamble. "It's not safe for either of us." "I need to talk to you about Princess Isabella," Thomas said quietly. "About what happened in her final months." Thornfield closed her eyes and was silent for a long moment. When she opened them again, Thomas could see tears threatening to spill over. "I've been waiting 5 years for someone to ask me about that," she whispered, "but I never thought it would be someone from the palace." Thomas explained what he had witnessed and what he had discovered in the letters, without revealing specific details that might compromise his position if this conversation was ever reported. Thornfield listened with growing agitation, occasionally nodding in recognition when Thomas mentioned incidents that she had witnessed firsthand. "Everything in those letters is true," she finally said. "Isabella was documenting it all because she knew what was happening to her. She knew that someone was trying to destroy her credibility and force her out of royal life." Thornfield explained that the campaign against Isabella had begun gradually, almost imperceptibly. Small changes in protocol that seemed reasonable on the surface but were designed to isolate the princess from her support systems. Key staff members were transferred to other positions without explanation. Isabella's access to information was restricted under the guise of security updates. They started by controlling her schedule, Thornfield said. Important meetings would be rescheduled at the last minute. Charitable events would be double-booked with other royal engagements. Isabella would arrive to find that her appearance had been cancelled or that another royal family member had been sent in her place. The psychological pressure had been carefully calibrated to appear like a series of unfortunate coincidences rather than a deliberate campaign. But Isabella had been intelligent and observant, and she had quickly recognized the pattern. She started keeping detailed records of everything. Thornfield continued. Every conversation, every meeting, every change in procedure. She knew that if she was going to fight back, she needed evidence. Thomas asked about the security changes that Isabella had mentioned in her final letters. Thornfield's expression darkened as she described the systematic replacement of Isabella's trusted protection detail with officers who reported directly to senior palace officials.
Her regular driver, James Morrison, had been with her for 3 years.
He knew her routines, her preferences, and most importantly, he was loyal to her personally rather than to the palace hierarchy. One day, he was simply gone. No explanation, no farewell. Isabella was told that he had requested a transfer, but when she tried to contact him, she discovered that he had been reassigned to a position in Scotland and had been told not to discuss his previous duties. The replacement driver, according to Thornfield, had been chosen specifically because he had no personal loyalty to Isabella. He was a palace employee first and a protection officer second. More concerning was the fact that he had unlimited access to Isabella's vehicle and could have made modifications or installed monitoring equipment without her knowledge. Isabella became paranoid about her car in those final weeks, Thornfield said. She started insisting on walking whenever possible or using official palace vehicles with drivers she hadn't seen before. But on the night she died, she was driving her own car, the one that the new driver had been maintaining. Thomas asked about the journalist, Sarah Collins, whom Isabella had intended to contact with her evidence. Thornfield's expression became even more troubled. Isabella had been planning to meet with Sarah Collins the week after her death. The meeting was set up through an intermediary, someone who specialized in protecting whistleblowers and journalists from retaliation. Isabella had copies of all her evidence prepared for Collins, including photographs of documents and recordings of conversations. What happened to that evidence? It disappeared. Isabella's personal effects were cleaned out of her private quarters within hours of her death, before I could retrieve anything she had left for me. Official palace business, they said. Everything had to be secured and catalogued as part of the estate settlement. Thornfield explained that she had tried to contact Sarah Collins herself after Isabella's death, that the journalist had been unwilling to pursue the story without the evidence that Isabella had promised to provide. Without documentation, Collins couldn't verify any of the allegations, and publishing unsubstantiated accusations against senior royals would have been professional suicide. I tried to tell people what I had witnessed, Thornfield said, but I was just a secretary. No one was going to believe me over Lord Pemberton and the other senior advisors. And besides, I had signed confidentiality agreements that would have resulted in criminal charges if I had spoken publicly about internal palace matters. Thomas asked about Thornfield's own dismissal from her position. Her response confirmed his worst fears about the lengths to which the conspirators were willing to go to protect their secrets. I was fired for alleged breach of confidentiality 2 weeks before Isabella's death, she said. They claimed that I had shared sensitive information about Isabella's medical treatment with unauthorized personnel. It was completely false, but they had evidence that supported their accusations. Thornfield explained that someone had used her computer access codes to send emails containing information about Isabella's therapy sessions to external recipients. The recipients turned out to be journalists who immediately published stories about Isabella's mental health struggles, undermining her credibility and making her appear unstable. It was expertly done, Thornfield admitted. The emails came from my computer using my access codes, but I never sent them. Someone had copied my credentials and used them to frame me. I couldn't prove my innocence, and Isabella couldn't protect me without admitting that she had been sharing confidential information about palace operations with her secretary. The frame job had served multiple purposes. It removed one of Isabella's most trusted allies, while simultaneously creating evidence that could be used to discredit anything Thornfield might say in the future. If she ever tried to speak publicly about what she had witnessed, she would be dismissed as a disgruntled employee who had been fired for betraying royal trust. They gave me a choice, Thornfield said bitterly. Accept the dismissal quietly and receive a generous severance package, or fight the charges and face criminal prosecution for violating the Official Secrets Act. I had my pension to think about, and I knew that fighting would just make things worse for Isabella. Thomas realized that this same pattern would be repeated with anyone who tried to expose the truth. The conspirators had unlimited resources, legal immunity, and the ability to destroy reputations and lives with fabricated evidence. They could make anyone disappear from public life while maintaining the appearance of proper legal procedures. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that Isabella's letters had been destroyed along with all the other evidence. They didn't know that the letters still existed and that someone had photographed them. For the first time since Isabella's death, there was documentary evidence of the conspiracy that couldn't be dismissed as the fantasies of disgruntled employees or unstable minds. Thornfield provided Thomas with contact information for several other former palace employees who had been dismissed or transferred during Isabella's final year. She also gave him details about the intermediary who had been arranging Isabella's meeting with Sarah Collins. Most importantly, she provided him with the name of a security expert who could verify whether Isabella's car had been tampered with before her fatal accident. "Be careful," Thornfield warned, as their meeting concluded. "These people have killed once to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill again if they discover what you're doing." Thomas returned to Windsor that evening with a clearer understanding of what he was facing. This wasn't just about exposing past wrongdoing. The same people who had orchestrated Isabella's destruction were still in positions of power, still making decisions that affected the royal family and the nation. Lord Pemberton was still advising on palace policy. Queen Consort Camilla was still influencing royal charitable activities and public appearances. The conspiracy that had killed Princess Isabella was not a historical crime that could be safely exposed years after the fact. It was an ongoing criminal organization that continued to operate at the highest levels of British society. And now Thomas was the only person alive who could prove it. Over the next several days, Thomas began implementing a careful plan to document and verify the information in Isabella's letters. He used his access to palace records to confirm dates, times, and personnel assignments that Isabella had mentioned. He cross-referenced security logs with the incident she had described. Most importantly, he began copying files and documents that corroborated her accounts of meetings and decisions. The evidence was overwhelming. Every major detail in Isabella's letters could be verified through official palace records. The pattern of isolation, surveillance, and psychological pressure was clearly documented in the personnel files, security reports, and communication logs that Thomas was able to access. But verification was only the first step. Thomas needed a way to get this information to someone who could act on it without getting himself killed in the process. He needed protection, legal immunity, and most importantly, he needed to ensure that the evidence would be released even if something happened to him. The answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas remembered that Isabella had mentioned a particular phrase in one of her letters, the Crown's conscience. She had used this term to describe someone within the palace system who could be trusted to do the right thing, even when it conflicted with official policy. After careful investigation, Thomas realized that Isabella had been referring to Sir Marcus Wellington, the deputy private secretary to the monarch. Wellington was an elderly man with an impeccable reputation for integrity and discretion. More importantly, he had the authority and connections to ensure that explosive information reached the right people without being buried by the conspiracy. Thomas began planning an approach to Wellington that would protect both of them, while ensuring that Isabella's evidence reached someone who could act on it. But first, he needed to create insurance against retaliation. He needed to ensure that if anything happened to him, the truth about Princess Isabella's death would still come to light. The game was about to change, and Thomas Mitchell was about to transform from a silent guardian into the most dangerous enemy the royal conspiracy had ever faced. Thomas spent 2 weeks perfecting his insurance plan before making any direct contact with Sir Marcus Wellington. He created multiple copies of Isabella's letters and all supporting documentation, storing them in different locations, with instructions for their release if anything happened to him. One copy went to a safety deposit box in a bank in London. Another was mailed to his brother in Australia with instructions not to open the package unless Thomas failed to contact him for 30 days. A third copy was given to a solicitor in Edinburgh with similar instructions. The most important copy was prepared for immediate release to the press. Thomas had researched Sarah Collins and discovered that she was still working as an investigative journalist, now specializing in stories about government corruption and abuse of power. He prepared a comprehensive package for Collins that included not only Isabella's letters but also all the corroborating evidence he had gathered from palace records. This package was sealed and given to a courier service with instructions to deliver it to Collins if Thomas failed to check in with them every 72 hours. The system was designed to be automatic and irreversible once triggered. If something happened to Thomas, the story would break regardless of any attempts to cover it up. With his insurance in place, Thomas began the delicate process of approaching Sir Marcus Wellington. The deputy private secretary was known for his morning walks through Windsor Great Park, always alone and always following the same route. Thomas had observed this routine for several days before deciding to make contact during one of these walks. On a crisp autumn morning, Thomas positioned himself along Wellington's usual path, dressed in civilian clothes and appearing to be just another early morning jogger. When Wellington approached, Thomas fell into step beside him and spoke quietly without looking directly at him. "Sir Marcus, my name is Thomas Mitchell. I'm a security officer at the castle and I have information about Princess Isabella's death that you need to see." Wellington didn't break stride or show any outward reaction, but Thomas could sense the immediate tension in the older man's posture. "I don't know who you are or what you think you know," Wellington replied quietly. but this is neither the time nor the place for such conversations. Isabella wrote letters documenting a conspiracy against her, Thomas continued. Letters that prove her death wasn't an accident. I have copies and I have evidence that corroborates everything she wrote. Wellington stopped walking and turned to face Thomas for the first time. His expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes showed the sharp intelligence that had made him invaluable to the royal family for over 20 years. If what you're saying has any truth to it, Wellington said carefully, then approaching me like this puts both of our lives in danger. I know, Thomas replied. But Isabella trusted you. In her letters she called you the Crown's conscience. She believed you were someone who would do the right thing even when it was difficult. Wellington was quiet for a long moment, studying Thomas's face as if trying to read the truth behind his words. There's a small church in Eton, Wellington finally said. St. John the Evangelist. I sometimes attend evening services there on Wednesdays, 7 o'clock. Thomas understood. Wellington was agreeing to meet, but in a location where their conversation could appear accidental and where the presence of other people would provide some protection against immediate retaliation. The following Wednesday evening, Thomas arrived at the church early and positioned himself in a pew near the back. The service was sparsely attended, mostly older parishioners who seemed focused on their prayers rather than the other people present. When Wellington arrived, he chose a seat several pews ahead of Thomas and showed no sign of recognition. After the service ended and most of the congregation had departed, Wellington approached Thomas with the casual manner of someone making friendly conversation with a fellow worshipper. Walk with me, Wellington said quietly. There's a garden behind the church where we can speak privately. They made their way to a small garden area surrounded by high hedges. Wellington checked carefully to ensure they were alone before speaking. Show me, he said simply. Thomas handed him a folder containing copies of 3 of Isabella's letters and several pages of supporting documentation. Wellington read through the material carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave with each page. Dear God, Wellington whispered when he finished reading. She documented everything. Every detail can be verified through palace records, Thomas said. The personnel changes, the security modifications, the surveillance activities. It all matches what she wrote. Wellington was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of what he had read. Do you understand what you're asking me to do? He finally said. This evidence implicates some of the most powerful people in the country. Pursuing this could destroy the monarchy itself. With respect, sir, Thomas replied, the monarchy is already damaged. The question is whether it can survive the truth, or whether it will be destroyed by the lies. Wellington looked at Thomas with new respect. You're not just a security guard, are you? I was a sergeant in the military police before I joined Royal Protection, Thomas said. I know how to investigate crimes and how to document evidence. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This is a criminal case with documented proof. Wellington nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Thomas explained his insurance arrangements and his plan to ensure that the story would be released regardless of any attempts at retaliation. I need someone with your authority to ensure that there's an official investigation, Thomas said. Someone who can demand answers and protect the people who come forward with evidence. Wellington agreed to review all of Thomas's evidence and to begin making discreet inquiries within the palace system. But he warned Thomas that the process would be dangerous for everyone involved. The people you're accusing have unlimited resources and no scruples about using them, Wellington said. They've killed once to protect their secrets. They'll kill again if they feel threatened. Thomas had already accepted that risk, but what he learnt over the following days made him realize that the danger was even greater than he had imagined. 3 days after his meeting with Wellington, Thomas noticed that his daily routine was being monitored more closely than usual. Senior staff members who had never paid attention to him before began asking questions about his activities and his whereabouts during off-duty hours. His security clearance was subjected to a routine review that involved extensive background checks and interviews with his colleagues. Most ominously, Thomas discovered that his personal communications were being monitored. His phone calls were being recorded, his emails were being copied, and his internet browsing history was being tracked. The same surveillance techniques that had been used against Isabella were now being turned against him. Thomas realized that someone within the palace hierarchy had become suspicious of his activities. His meeting with Wellington might have been observed, or perhaps his investigation into palace records had triggered security alerts. Either way, the conspirators now knew that they faced a threat. The response was swift and sophisticated. Thomas received a formal notice that he was being transferred to a different position within the Royal Protection Unit. The new assignment would take him to Scotland, where he would be responsible for security at Balmoral Castle during the off-season when the royal family was not in residence. On the surface, the transfer appeared to be a promotion. The position came with increased pay and enhanced responsibilities. But Thomas understood the real purpose. The isolated location would make it difficult for him to continue his investigation or to meet with contacts like Wellington. More importantly, it would remove him from Windsor Castle and any access to the evidence he needed to build his case. Thomas had 1 week to report to his new position. If he refused the transfer, he would face disciplinary action that could result in his dismissal from royal service. Either way, the conspirators were ensuring that he would no longer be a threat to their operations. But they had underestimated Thomas's preparation and his commitment to justice for Princess Isabella. The insurance mechanisms he had put in place were designed specifically for this kind of retaliation. His failure to report to the new position would trigger the automatic release of all evidence to the press within 72 hours. Thomas faced an impossible choice. If he accepted the transfer, he would lose any chance of continuing his investigation and ensuring that Isabella's killers were brought to justice. But if he refused, he would become a target for elimination, and there was no guarantee that the evidence would reach the right people even if it was released. The decision was made for him when Wellington contacted him through an intermediary with an urgent message. The deputy private secretary had begun his own discreet investigation and had uncovered evidence that the conspiracy was planning to eliminate Thomas before he could cause any more problems. According to Wellington's sources, arrangements were being made for Thomas to have an accident during his travel to Scotland. The remote Highland roads were notoriously dangerous, especially during autumn weather conditions. A single vehicle crash could easily be attributed to driver error or poor road conditions. Wellington's message included an urgent warning and a proposal. If Thomas was willing to trust him completely, Wellington could arrange for protection and ensure that the evidence reached people who could act on it. But it would require Thomas to disappear from his normal life immediately and to place himself entirely under Wellington's protection. Thomas had less than 24 hours to make a decision that would determine not only his own survival, but also whether Princess Isabella's killers would ever face justice. The boy who had joined the army to serve his country and the man who had dedicated his life to protecting the royal family was about to become a fugitive in order to save the institution he had sworn to serve. The irony was not lost on him. To protect the crown from its enemies, Thomas would have to become an enemy of the crown himself. To save the monarchy from the criminals who had infiltrated it, he would have to destroy the careers and reputations of some of its most powerful figures. But as Thomas looked at the photograph of Princess Isabella that he kept in his wallet, he knew that he had no choice. She had died trying to expose the truth about the corruption that surrounded her. The least he could do was ensure that her death had not been in vain. Thomas Mitchell, loyal servant of the Crown for 15 years, was about to become the most wanted man in Britain, and if he was very lucky and very careful, he might just live long enough to see justice done. Thomas made his decision at 3 o'clock in the morning. Sitting in his small flat with Isabella's photograph in his hands, and the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him like a physical force. He would trust Wellington completely, disappear from his current life, and ensure that the truth about Princess Isabella's death finally came to light, regardless of the personal cost. He sent a coded message to Wellington using the communication protocol they had established, then began the careful process of erasing his presence from his flat without making it obvious that he had left voluntarily. The apartment needed to look like he had simply gone to work as usual, giving him at least a few hours before his absence would be noticed. At dawn, Thomas left his flat for the last time and made his way to a small railway station 20 miles from Windsor. Wellington was waiting for him in an unremarkable sedan, dressed in civilian clothes and looking every bit like an ordinary businessman, rather than one of the most influential figures in the British government. From this moment on, Wellington said as Thomas got into the car, "You're under my protection. But understand that this protection extends only as long as you do exactly what I tell you to do. One mistake, one moment of independent action, and we're both dead." They drove in silence through the countryside toward London, Wellington taking a circuitous route that avoided main highways and traffic cameras. Thomas realized that the deputy private secretary had clearly planned for this contingency, suggesting that he had been investigating the conspiracy for longer than he had initially admitted. "How long have you known?" Thomas asked. "I've suspected for years that something was wrong with the official account of Isabella's death," Wellington replied. "But I had no proof, and more importantly, I had no one I could trust with my suspicions. The conspiracy reaches too high into the palace hierarchy for traditional investigative methods. Wellington explained that he had been conducting his own discreet investigation for over a year, using his position and access to review files and records that others assumed he was examining for routine administrative purposes. But it had been Thomas's evidence that provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. Isabella's letters prove premeditation, Wellington said. Without them, everything else could be dismissed as coincidence or routine palace politics. But her documentation of specific threats and the timeline leading to her death transforms this from speculation into a criminal case. They arrived at a safe house in North London, a modest terraced house in a residential neighbourhood that showed no outward signs of special significance. Inside, Thomas was introduced to Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison of Scotland Yard's Serious Crimes Unit, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for pursuing cases that other officers considered too politically sensitive to handle. Morrison had been briefed by Wellington and had already begun reviewing the evidence that Thomas had gathered. Her reaction was immediate and unequivocal. "This is the most significant criminal conspiracy I've ever encountered," she said bluntly. "If this evidence is authentic, we're looking at murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and treason. The people involved have committed crimes that carry life sentences." Morrison explained that she had been working with a small team of trusted officers to verify the evidence and build a case that could withstand the inevitable challenges from powerful defense attorneys and political pressure. The process required absolute secrecy because the conspirators had contacts throughout the police and judicial systems. "We've been able to confirm most of the details in Princess Isabella's letters through independent sources," Morrison said. "The personnel changes, the security modifications, the surveillance activities. We've also found evidence of financial irregularities in the palace accounts that suggest payments were made to private security firms for services that were never officially authorized. But the most damning evidence had come from an unexpected source. Morrison's team had contacted James Morrison, Isabella's former driver, who had been transferred to Scotland just before her death. Initially reluctant to speak about his experiences, Morrison had eventually provided testimony that corroborated Isabella's fears about her vehicle being tampered with. Morrison told us that he had noticed unusual modifications to Princess Isabella's car during his final week of service, the detective inspector explained. Changes to the brake system and steering mechanism that he didn't recognize and couldn't explain. When he asked about them, he was told that they were routine security upgrades. Morrison had also managed to locate the mechanic who had performed the modifications. Under pressure and facing criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy, the mechanic had agreed to provide testimony about the specific changes he had been ordered to make to Isabella's car. "The modifications were designed to cause brake failure at high speed," Morrison said quietly. "They were sophisticated enough to appear accidental, but reliable enough to ensure a fatal outcome. Princess Isabella didn't die in a random accident. She was murdered." The evidence was overwhelming, but bringing the conspirators to justice would require careful coordination between multiple agencies and unprecedented security measures. The people involved had the resources and connections to flee the country, destroy evidence, or eliminate witnesses if they suspected that their crimes were about to be exposed. Morrison outlined the plan that she and Wellington had developed. Simultaneous arrest would be made of all major conspirators, including Lord Pemberton, Queen Consort Camilla, and several other senior palace officials. The arrest would be coordinated with seizure of documents and electronic records that might contain additional evidence. "We have one chance to get this right," Morrison emphasized. "If we move too soon, or if there are any leaks, the conspirators will disappear and the evidence will be destroyed. But if we wait too long, they might discover what we're doing and move against us first." Thomas's role in the operation would be crucial but dangerous. As the primary witness and the person who had discovered Isabella's letters, he would need to provide testimony that could withstand intense cross-examination by the best defense attorneys that money could buy. But first, he would need to survive long enough to testify. The safe house would be his home for the foreseeable future, with around-the-clock protection provided by Morrison's trusted officers. His communications would be monitored and controlled to prevent any leaks about his location or activities. Most importantly, he would need to remain completely hidden until the arrests were made and the conspirators were in custody. "They've already noticed your absence," Wellington warned. "Palace Security has launched a search for you, officially because of your failure to report for your new assignment. But we know that the real purpose is to eliminate you before you can testify about what you've discovered." Thomas asked about the automatic release mechanisms he had put in place to protect himself. Morrison smiled grimly as she explained that her team had already intercepted all of Thomas's insurance packages. "We couldn't risk having the evidence released prematurely through uncontrolled channels," she said. But don't worry, the evidence is safe and it will be released at the right time as part of our coordinated operation. The plan called for the arrest to be made in 6 days, during a period when all the major conspirators would be in London for a series of royal engagements. The timing would minimize their ability to flee while maximizing the impact of simultaneous arrests. But first, Morrison needed to complete her investigation by gathering additional evidence and testimony from other witnesses. Margaret Thornfield had already agreed to testify about her experiences as Isabella's private secretary. Several other former palace employees had been contacted and were cooperating with the investigation. Most importantly, Morrison's team had discovered additional evidence in the form of electronic communications between the conspirators. Emails, text messages and phone records that documented the planning and coordination of the campaign against Isabella had been retrieved through carefully executed search warrants. Modern criminals always leave electronic footprints, Morrison explained. The conspirators thought they were too powerful to be investigated, so they were careless about concealing their communications. We have records of meetings, discussions about timeline and methods, and even arguments about whether murder was necessary or whether they could achieve their goals through other means. The electronic evidence showed that the conspiracy had initially hoped to force Isabella into voluntary exile through psychological pressure and public humiliation, but when she refused to abandon her charitable work and her plans to expose palace corruption, they had escalated to more direct action. The decision to kill her was made just 2 weeks before her death, Morrison said. We have email records of Lord Pemberton arguing that they had no choice but to permanently resolve the Isabella problem before her scheduled speech about institutional transparency. Thomas spent his days in the safe house reviewing evidence, preparing for his eventual testimony, and trying to process the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. They were preparing to arrest and prosecute some of the most powerful people in Britain for the murder of a beloved princess. The political and social implications would be enormous. Wellington visited regularly to coordinate between Morrison's investigation and the palace's official response to the coming revelations. Plans were being made for how the monarchy would address the crisis once the arrests were made and the evidence became public. The institution will survive, Wellington assured Thomas, but it will be forever changed. The level of accountability and transparency that Isabella died trying to achieve will finally be implemented, but at a cost that no one should have had to pay. On the night before the planned arrests, Thomas sat alone in the safe house garden, thinking about Princess Isabella and the courage she had shown in her final months. She had known that speaking truth to power could cost her everything, but she had continued documenting the conspiracy against her because she believed that the truth was more important than her personal safety. Tomorrow, her killers would finally face justice. The evidence she had gathered at the cost of her life would be presented to the world, and the people who had murdered her would be held accountable for their crimes. It wouldn't bring her back, but it would ensure that her death had meaning beyond the tragedy itself. Thomas had started this journey as a security guard trying to protect royal secrets. He was ending it as the key witness in the most important criminal case in modern British history. Princess Isabella had trusted him to keep her safe, and he had failed. But now, 5 years too late, he was finally going to fulfill that obligation by ensuring that her killers faced the justice they had thought their power and position would protect them from forever. The next morning would bring vindication, justice, and a transformation of everything that Thomas had spent his life protecting. Princess Isabella's truth was about to set everyone free, even if freedom came at a price that no one should have had to pay.